Right now we are in a massive crisis, a period of change. Our society is broken. So breaking that trust or that conglomerate is a false illusion because the power is still so concentrated. And that leads to the problem. And you're usually going to get your source of funding from the NIH, and all those grants they have strings attached.
Yeah. Hi there, Sifu Slim with Jason Jewell to my right, and we've just shared a nice conversation about social history, looking at human beings, Homo sapiens, throughout parts of the course of history, and sharing observations. We're not sharing foregone conclusions or hypotheses that have been proved. We're sharing observations and commentary, so that's really how we're asking you to take this in and to share your counterpoints, your agreements, whatever you have to share in an honorable fashion. So now we have a discussion that comes out of the idea of social history. How is the human being in society, whether they live on a farm, a city, whether they're traveling in the military, whether they're a traveling pilot or a tennis player, whatever, when they start to think about the system in which they live, whether it's democratic, dictatorship, socialist, whatever it is, how do they look at that and how do they compare that to other societies? And how do they look at those other philosophies with people who think they have a solution to a problem and quantify it, qualify it, examine it, etc. So I sent Jason a video from Professor Richard Wolff, who is a socialist and an expert on Marxism, and he's shared in some of his videos that in the 60s when he started in this field, it was common for universities to have a department where they had at least one person who specialized in Marx, Hegel, etc., philosophy and economics. And that's been slowly eliminated from the face of most of the academia in the Western world, if not all of the world. And he shares a little bit about that in some of his commentary. So what I say about Richard Wolff is that he cares about facts, he cares about history, he cares about things that work or could work, and he cares about truth. Now, I asked Jason to weigh in on some of these things, some of these facts and opinions presented by Dr. Wolff, and we'll take a look at that now. But Wolff's opinion, by and large, is that the capitalistic society has made their attempt, and always along the way, it's bred socialism because there's such a huge dichotomy and difference between the owners of the means of production and the lowly worker who can be eliminated or discounted in some way, that there's such a difference in those that naturally socialism, which would hope to give that lowly worker more rights and more chances to organize, would be dragged along with that. So I'll ask Jason to weigh in on some of these things.
Is there a specific question, or just want me to comment on his video, or?
Yeah, why don't we start out with why Richard Wolff is concerned about this? In your opinion, why is Richard Wolff concerned about these things, and the fact that Marxism has been eliminated from academia by and large?
Okay, so I think he's concerned for the state of capitalism, which is what he's arguing in his video. For very good reason, right? We're at a moment right now where the dichotomy between rich and poor is stretching and growing and at very problematic levels. So it does beg the question, how did we get here and what's wrong? So I think that's a very, very valid question for him to ask, or anyone to ask right now, and to chime in with your own responses and opinions. He's obviously a long-term Marxist going back 50, 60 years, so he's obviously coming from that kind of point of view. I think so. When you have a problem, I think, in my opinion, maybe he's a little, I don't necessarily agree with his analysis, but if you just conclude that capitalism is broken, which he has, and by the way, he's not the only one. There's a growing chorus in academia, one of which is Yannis, forget his last name. He's Greek, he's the former finance of Greece. And he's also chiming in. He's on the stump speech right now. He's out on YouTube. He's all over the place, getting a lot of FaceTime with the message that capitalism is broken. And he's chiming in with his response, Greece being in Europe, Greece being, a long-term old republic. There, he has a very similar response.
Long-time economic crisis in Greece, and as of 2014, they were still dragging in World War II and the damage the Germans did to Greece as a reason why they were underperforming all these years, still asking for handouts from Germany and the EU to revamp their system. But in a lot of people's opinion, the two big draggers on Greece are low work ethic and what's the other one I was trying to think of? Oh, a large black market. So lots of not paying your taxes, therefore the government, the banking system can't work with you to build industry, but it's old school, black market, not paying your taxes type of thing. Those are two things that I read. I don't know if in 2022 those are still valid, but those are two things to consider in this mix.
Yeah, and then, just to go with that, you have to ask yourself of a highly socialist system like Europe, does that really work? Does that over decades breed lower work ethic and lower output, especially when you're competing with a rising tiger like China, where they'll do anything and sacrifice. They have a culturally long-term cultural attitude that they do plan for the very long term. They're willing to sacrifice in the short term. It's not. It's family oriented. It's not individually driven. So 6 family members will sacrifice for the one chosen one within the family that will get the family the farthest, and that person is expected to perform, and they'll throw all resources at it. And when you're competing with that, when you with a older empire and in a socialist country that does have a lot of handouts, where you can say, why work when I can just receive. And I thought that when I was traveling in Europe 20 years ago, I was thinking, this is sort of unsustainable, where you have the U.S. have a one extreme, let work
the juggernaut.
Yeah, live to work and exceed, excel, and achieve, and get accolades, and build your career, and get money, and all these endless pursuits. And here you have the other side, Europe, which is just, they're just hanging out and not really being productive and not really being competitive. Is there sort of a middle solution? And one of the things that's presented is that the last 100 years was maybe all the conflicts. Partly, this is not necessarily widely accepted, but this is one thesis out there that I find interesting, is all these systems, fascism, corporatism, communism, Marxism, democracy, all these different sort of socioeconomic systems were competing in a sense with each other. And observationally, how do humans and societies respond to these systems? And one thing that was posited is China, the blueprint, right? Which was a quasi. It's still uncertain. China is still developing its final blueprint, but the overall orientation of its blueprint will be some sort of mix between capitalism and command and control economy.
So where does this come from, our debate? It's an old debate. According to Richard Wolff, capitalism goes back to the 1600s in England, and then it was parodied in Charlie Chaplin's film Modern Times, which was his last film as the Little Tramp, or as the Tramp, found him facing very different predicaments. This is Modern Man in Modern Times in 1930s. Very different predicaments in the aftermath of America's Great Depression, when mass unemployment coincided with the mass rise of the industrial automation age. And so here's Charlie Chaplin in that lovely picture in the grid, sacrificing himself for the company, but he fails in that film to do that. And then they talk about the other problems at the time, which are not so very different from the anxieties we face now: poverty, unemployment, strikes and strike breakers, political intolerance, economic inequalities, the tyranny of the machine, and narcotics. And so the subtitle of this movie, Modern Times, is the story of industry, of individual enterprise, humanity crusading in the pursuit of happiness, is followed by the symbolic juxtaposition of shots of sheep being herded and of workers streaming out of a factory. So the human as the sheep being herded in and herded out. Where's the humanity in that is the question Charlie Chaplin is pillaring in his movie.
Pink Floyd, the Pink Floyd song, The Wall.
Another
What's that long?
Another chip in the wall.
Another brick in the wall.
Another brick in the wall.
Yeah, a lot of their lyrics are very similar to modern times.
Teacher, leave those kids alone.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that song. Yep.
So inhuman work on the conveyor belt being used, humans as a guinea pig to test the machine to feed workers as they work. So fantastic job that Charlie Chaplin did in modern times, and what a physical comedian he was. This is all in the non-talky age, so the incredible job he did. So back to Richard Wolff, who grew up with parents who came from Germany and France, and he had a Jewish background. His family had to leave Germany in the 1930s, and they made it to America. And now he did all of these wonderful colleges, I think Harvard and Yale and Stanford. I mean, his pedigree in academia is pretty impressive. And he's a very rational thinker, but he hasn't, as far as I know, kind of like Joe Biden and Barack Obama, hasn't participated in the normal workaday life. It's always been either legal or legal / government or completely government. Those were those politicians I mentioned. And then on the side of Richard Wolff, academia and studies and research. So it's different being in academia than it is being in quote unquote the corporate world or the business world. What do you have to share about that examination?
Yeah, so I think he's coming from one specific place, and he's been there for a long time. And so we have this he's been probably proselytizing it for decades and decades, and now we're at a moment where the system appears broken, and so it's easy to kind of chime in and say, "See, I told you," and here's the solution. By the way, people. So I just sort of disagree with the way his approach is. I think capitalism is a system that can work, did work, and the question, there's no examination on his part, in my mind, of why it's not working, how it's ceased to work, what are the problems that we have. He pointed to 3 or 4 specific things to highlight the moment where we are as an example of how capitalism is not working. The first was COVID-19, our failed response to it. The second was our poor D and F grade infrastructure in the United States of America. The third was the growing wealth disparity. The fourth was offshoring our businesses and technologies to China. So that's an example of how, in his mind, Wolff's mind, that board of directors, small groups of people with ultimate power make these profit-driven decisions, that in Wolff's mind would not have been made had we had a more democratic, cooperative approach to decision-making in these 4 key areas. So I could go through in each of those 4 key areas and kind of challenge each of those 4 comments from Professor Wolff, or we can also go back and examine capitalism and how it worked and why it ceased to work, which is where we are now, which is something that really Professor Wolff didn't address at all in his talk.
Why don't you share your counterpoints on the main points that Dr. Wolff made?
Okay, so the first one we'll take one at a time. If you want to interject in between each of them, up to you. The first one's COVID-19. So basically, he's saying that the United States is, they're 4% of the world's population, 20% of deaths. So he's saying that because of COVID deaths. So the 4% versus 20%, that is completely incongruent with the fact that we're the largest, wealthiest economy in the world.
Big medicine.
Right. Why didn't we have all these resources, infrastructure, financial resources? Why did we not respond? That should never have happened. So the first thing I'd like to challenge, and that's a whole separate subject, is COVID-19, and I'm not going to get into it in a big way. But one of the examples he gave was just equipment, right? So ventilators. So ventilators do actually aid the death rate of COVID. So it's not, it's
a last resort.
Yeah, it's what was used in a protocol in a hospital setting. It is not what should be used. There's 3 stages to COVID. The final stage basically is where you have the cytokine storm, is where your immune system goes to overdrive. and you do not want to use a ventilator that opens up your airways. It's counterintuitive because your airways are constricted. It's a classic Western medicine response. We have a symptom, let's address the symptom. But it's counterintuitive because once you open the airwaves, the immune system's already going haywire, and then your immune system even goes further into AWOL, haywire state, and you die. You go into a cytokine storm, you die. So the responses to COVID-19 is a big subject. But the point that he's making is that whatever it is, whether it was ventilators, masks don't work either. There's been over 70 studies to show that masks don't work. But whatever it may be, right, whether it's masks or it's a vaccine or it's a ventilator, we can debate all that. His point is the system that we have should have stockpiled those devices or drugs. My response to that is that is what governments are for. That's what governments have always done. When it's a question of national emergency, strategic value, a government will stockpile oil. A government in 2009 with the H1N1 virus stockpiled Gilead's drug, Tamiflu. And so Tamiflu was stockpiled. And so the government can and will, cooperatively, right, strategically spend the public's money to strategically build these reserves that will protect us from a famine or from whatever attack or challenge. So that's the first response. I disagree with Wolff on the COVID-19 issue right there.
The only comment I have on that is, shouldn't there be in place a protocol for handling these things with response people who, instead of, like in World War II, it was very quick that the United States turned the motor companies, the General Motors, the Fords, etc., into building weaponry for the war, tanks, jeeps, trucks, and then the airplane companies switched from private, transportation, public transportation, to wartime airplanes. And they did that very quickly and efficiently. Why don't we have in place people around the United States at universities and corporations that are in these spheres where they know the role in a response, and we do tests periodically, maybe once a year or twice a year, or whatever, where they have to, with a Google Doc or whatever software they're using, they have to do a mock preparation of ordering whatever the response is, and then the corporations are incentivized to respond in a very quick way in changing what's happening on the factory floor, what the sales force is doing, how everyone teams up to get that new response organized and out to the citizens, and then out to any poorer countries that don't have such a system. What's so hard about that? It seems like it's so basic. And then I do remember Trump eliminating a lot of jobs that were in the response to pandemics. I forget what that group is in the federal government, but Trump eliminated those jobs right off the bat, and the savings wasn't significant for a country with a very high GNP. It sounded very strange that happened.
That is strange. I'm not really, but the bigger question is the response, and I think it's a good question. I think the key there is to know thy enemy. So if you have a cyber attack, if Russia attacks Ukraine, the enemy is very clear. The danger is present, and clear and present danger. And so I think that you in the cyber attack, you have to have cyber experts and cryptologists or whatever. That's not my area of expertise, but you need to be able to do some analysis to you're being attacked. That's clear. There might be a hidden veil, and so you have to pierce the veil, and you might have to expose and then shut down whoever your attacker is. But there's a clear path. The timeline of which is unclear. But you can and same thing if there's like a physical attack that's also very clear. In something like the pandemic, it's to me it's not as clear. What is the virus? How does it behave? How do we defend ourselves? How do we know? How do we respond? With what do we respond? I think that is still, in my mind, still up in the air. Yeah. So that's, I think, one of the big challenges about the pandemic, that I don't know if that will go away or not, because all viruses are different. I think I know what the system would say, and Bill Gates would say, is that now we have this mRNA technology, we can develop viruses very vaccines very quickly, and then that should be our quick World War II level type of mobilization and response. That's where this is all going. I would challenge that, but separate subject. But definitely, I think that to your response, that's what I would say is, what's the enemy? Know thy enemy. And the second one is just leadership. So I think that's why the president has the ability to declare a state of war, and somewhat Trump, no pun intended, the powers of Congress to go out and respond in a military fashion quickly, decisively. Leadership is very important. So those are the two things. And for COVID, how we had part with Trump, part with Biden, different responses, different attitudes. But even Trump fell in line after a while. Ultimately, he was belittling masks, belittling the vaccine, as was Musk, by the way. They both kind of fell in line at the end of the day, got their shot. And
something I learned recently is that starting in the 1970s, I believe it was in the United States, there was a big shift of academic backgrounds of people that were high elected officials. If you went back pre-1960s, there was a higher percentage. I think it might have even been in the 35% rate of high government officials that had a scientific education.
Yeah.
Starting in the 1970s, that dropped drastically, and so that when you got in the decades beyond the 1970s, the number went down to something under 5%. Most of the people came from a legal background, so they were very good at argumentation, knowing the laws, passing bills, all these types of things, but understanding what, let's say, climate change was, etc. They had very limited ability to do that. Understanding of the problems of big agriculture and fossil fuel use, etc., or understanding the shortcomings of alternative energies. They were not very well educated and equipped to handle that, so they had to either take somebody's word for it or listen to a lobbyist who was throwing tens of millions or hundreds of millions of dollars at them to respond with laws that were favorable to a scientific background that wasn't sustainable. So that was a big problem starting in the 1970s, the lack of science education. And in industry, engineers have always been sought out, architects as well, and scientists always been highly sought after. But in politics, you would figure we would need some of those people too, because it's a huge question, but we've fallen extremely short on that.
In politics?
And, having scientific background, high politics.
Dr. Rand Paul of Kentucky is a doctor, as was his father, Ron Paul. And so you have him challenging Fauci in a very eloquent, researched, credible way. They are doctors, and very well researched. And I tune in to that. And it just doesn't get distributed. So then it comes down to a media question. So I think there's some scientific expertise in the political sphere, probably not enough. But it's there. It's not absent completely.
Yeah. But it was just a percentage that it used to be a high percent,
sure. Okay, yeah.
30,
sure,
and then it went down to 5 or something like that.
Yeah.
With those people, like a scientist isn't concerned at age 22 to 26 of building constituencies like George Bush II was. He was very good at building constituencies of bands of people with money to help him get elected, to help run his campaign. These scientists aren't designed like that, most of them. They're designed to solve problems and to innovate and do all the things scientists do, study things. They're not glad handers typically. They're not sellout people historically. They have other motivations.
I would challenge that, because the NIH and all the scientists are poor. They're like artists.
They're susceptible.
They're poor unless you work for Pfizer, and then that's a whole different story. And you're just a true researcher, scientist, trying to do research, publish it, or do novel innovations or whatever. You're generally pretty poor, and you're usually going to get your source of funding from the NIH, and all those grants they have strings attached.
Yeah.
Make no mistake about it.
Yeah, got you.
And if the scientist is pursuing a project that is not supported, they'll usually get marginalized.
I wrote one statement down. What do lobbyists want? And the short answer I came up with is to get grants and contracts for their clients. They get a commission on all the successes that they do. And then to get bills passed that benefit their organization. So they're on the payroll. It used to be in the 70s, it might have been 500,000 to a million. Now it could be in the tens of millions or 50 million or 200 million as a lobbyist. And how are you going to track that? And we're looking where the tentacles are. That's quite a thing. And then I wrote down, what do public relation reps do? They peddle and print propaganda. So those are just two little pieces of what they do. And I think the average citizen doesn't understand that. The power of the tentacles and the power of the propaganda, they're very susceptible. And one of the reasons I think they're susceptible is it takes a lot of work and a lot of doubting and questioning the structure of things, which is a drain on us emotionally sometimes. It was for me when I used to think very high thoughts of the American system and the government. When I started looking into what the CIA has done around the world, it was like getting hit by a baseball bat repeatedly for the first 2 years that I did that. And then it sort of tainted my life in terms of knowing how dark the reality is. Your thoughts on that? How dark is reality? Did that affect you, and when did you first realize that how dark reality can be?
I don't know what to say. I beat to a very different rhythm. I see the world in a very different way from most anyone that I study, and I'm not really afraid of things. And okay, it just the topic kind of shifted, so I'm trying to roll with it. To that, I'll respond in this way. When I was 15, I was a public debater, and I gave a speech in front of World War II and Korean vets about what the American flag meant to me. That was the topic of the speech. I got up in front of them and said, essentially, it doesn't mean anything to me. And almost the whole room fell off their chairs. They were wearing all these medals and Purple Hearts. And I said, well, now wait a minute. I feel like I haven't earned it. I'm 15, 16 years old. And here you guys have all done all these acts of valor and public service. You've earned it, I haven't, So to me, it's a hope and a dream, and I hope. So I was fascinated with heroes from that point forward, and I ended up playing for my country in the World Junior Championships in Hong Kong, and met the last British governor of Hong Kong in 1992 before it was turned over to the Chinese, and I became very fascinated with heroes. And at Princeton, I wrote my thesis on Eisenhower to the end of electing heroes, soldiers, heroes, generals, winners of wars to the White House, and where their value. And it's been a slippery slope for me, okay? For me, it's always wanting to find virtue. I'm very driven by justice, fairness. And you look at the system and you just, maybe I'll find it in Patton, maybe I'll find it in Eisenhower. Where can I find this? And to me, it's just a series of disappointments after disappointments. And then that leads to me, well, why? And then it becomes compromised value in a system that has its meat hooks, or you use the word tentacles, into all angles of it, where it's kind of in a checkmate situation where it's very hard to operate virtuously, in my opinion. And so that's my response to that. How do you find virtue in a system that itself, in my mind, is so compromised? And the meat of it, when you go to a surface level, you can try to compartmentalize it, which I think is a wrong exercise, because it is all intertwined, and so, when you reach the end of one system, it's connected to another, and you have to understand how it's connected, and what are the agendas, and what is being funded, what is being presented in the media, how is it being presented. And when you go through that exercise, then it comes to a different level of understanding. And so for me, it's I've shifted from not looking for virtue and not being disappointed or disillusioned or cynical by it, because I'm a very happy, optimistic person. It's really more of what is the truth. That's what I've shifted to. And I can accept my journey is, my unraveling of the onion, my discovering of the truth. Because the truth is the truth. The truth sets you free. You don't need to judge it or be saddened by it. It just is. And so I think a true academic, should be driven by that. But all these layers and all these contingencies, a lot of times checkmate people and direct and filter people, and that's what they end up doing. And no one wants to believe that. Everyone wants to believe that they're advancing society, providing a benefit for, that's what people want to believe. People are generally good. People generally are good. So to me, then it becomes, because that's what they want to believe, but I don't believe that's the ultimate truth. I think that virtuously, they sugarcoat it, right? And they socialize together, and you believe your own confirmation bias. You believe your own BS to some extent to save your own sanity, that what you're doing is a good thing.
Yeah.
And you are truly driven that way. I believe most people are driven that way. So there's sort of what I'm describing is, I believe there's some kind of a disconnect there.
If you are testing yourself with these observations and you don't know where to go with it, I have a couple of questions that may help you. And it's very simple. Ask yourself the question, are scandals part of Hollywood? Nobody would disagree with that. We see it in the paper all the time. There's a scandal. This producer is coercing these women so they can get jobs. This agent is being paid off by this person to get a job over that person. Scandals are there. People die in bathtubs on overdoses all the time in the music and the Hollywood businesses. Next, are scandals part of government officials? And the answer is yes, of course. Are they part of organizations in general? Yes, they are. So where am I leading with that? What do you call it when a scandal gets swept under the rug? So we know they're scandals. We know they stop appearing in the press, or they're buried at the end of page 40 in a newspaper, or page 20 on a little column, right? What do you call that if it's not a conspiracy? You have to make up your minds on that. It's up to you. What about a scandal that gets swept under the rug for several decades? So you can test yourself on those things. You can follow the money, which a lot of people say is one way to do it. Follow the influence is another way. And now I want to talk about infrastructure. So I was fortunate to have spent some time in San Clemente recently, which is where Richard Nixon spent a lot of time. And he was seen, amazingly enough, as a local icon in a positive way. And I don't know if he was a glad-hander or if he was just a famous person or why they thought that, but he's not a likable person. None of the people that worked with him were friends of his, including Kissinger, who was his closest person in office for several years. Kissinger said, we were never friends, and Nixon had a hard time with friendship. But the infrastructure, I'm down in San Clemente, and I had a chance to speak with a professional engineer, which is a very high degree to get. It's very difficult. It's a state test in each state you go to. Imagine that this person, I know how hard it is to get a few licenses, because I've had a few licenses that require lots of study. Imagine getting a professional engineering degree for one state. Now, imagine this person did it in 50 states. I would imagine not many people in the history of America have gone to each state and taken their tests. He said it was a 10-year program, and it currently costs him $200,000 a year to maintain all the licensing and insurance to be a professional engineer in those states. And I asked him in our conversation, I said, I remember reading 20 years ago just about our bridges, not the road, but just about the bridges in America. Most were built between 1900 and 1940, and they have a lifespan of X, and that lifespan ended sometime 20 to 30 years ago for 90% of those bridges. He said, yeah, it's more like 70, but it's a significant problem. And now we're going to go to infrastructure and Richard Wolff, the Marxian professor. What do you have to share about infrastructure?
Okay. Yeah, so I think, again, most roads are, built by the government and maintained by the government. Eisenhower in the 50s did the interstate freeway system. And so I think that's managed publicly with public funds. There are some assets like airports, which are private and that are public. In some countries they're public, some countries they're private. And so, like in England, they've privatized a lot of their airports and they've privatized more of their roadways. And that's the debate that we've been having the last 20 years as this infrastructure has continued to age and we haven't solved the problem. The question becomes, should we privatize it or keep it public? Most likely we're going down the road of privatization. But to me, does that demonstrate his point that capitalism is broken? No. Because infrastructure is mostly a public asset, In some cases, it's private. There's the option to make it public, or to make it private, whatever the case may be. So there's room to kind of manage that. I don't think it demonstrates, to me in my mind, that capitalism is broken. The final point I'll make about infrastructure is that I believe in crisis and solution. I think that's a lot of the way the system works, and even if you don't believe in quote unquote the system, I think that's a lot of the way describes the way the human psyche works. So people don't like change, right? And so what ends up happening is that if you don't like change, but you have a problem, you don't change. The problem builds, and then eventually it blows up because it's unsustainable, right? Problem goes, air in a balloon. It grows, there's only so much room in the balloon before it pops, right? So there's the visual. And so then once it blows up in your face, you're left with a massive crisis. Okay, you had a problem that evolves into a massive crisis, and then you have to solve it. Then you're forced to change because the conditions are so uncomfortable that whatever issue you had with change before just is irrelevant at that point, and you just say, please end this pain, and then the solution is there waiting for you. And then the society then molds into whether they walk into it or they just put their hands in the air like a prisoner, I surrender, or whatever way in which they cross the line to the solution that ends up taking. So I think infrastructure is one of those things that builds up into what we have in this bigger argument. Is this capitalism working? It's easy to look at China and say, look at their infrastructure. Not to say that they have buildings and bridges that they are brand new, they're all collapsing, but they have modern airports. If you look at mostly at the Chinese economy, that's only at 20. All these it's their 1900 and 1940. Everything they're building is from scratch and brand new. So you look at these shiny objects that are beautiful, that have modern technologies, and they function very well. And you compare it to our failing D- roads and bridges, and we look like a third world country, and they look like the first world country. So if you're a Marxist, and you're looking to throw darts, at the board, it's easy to do that. To use that it's a perfect example for Professor Wolff to demonstrate his point. To say, look, we're the third world country. The third world country is a first world country. Capitalism has failed. Well, I just disagree with that. I think that we could solve the problem. We can solve the problem. We're just not solving the problem. And then to that, which I will add back the leadership point that I made with COVID, I'll add that back and lay that over into the infrastructure comment that we're currently now on, and say this. One of the arguments that, like a Professor Wolff would make too, is the long-term planning. China has their 5-year plans, and they sort of have a 50-year plan and segment into 5-year chunks. And, President Xi has been there since 12 years or so, 2009, something like that, maybe 2012, at least 10 years. And so having, a situation where you've got Bush, then Trump, then Biden, those are extreme leaders, very different. In a moment where we are polarizing, you have leaders that reflect the polarization, and it just shines a light on the fact that we can't get anything done. You have a liberal president, but then now you have an ultra conservative Supreme Court because of the 3 justices that Trump put in there. And so you have, this seeming backward moment where Roe v. Wade was just canceled. And so you have this leadership problem and then it's easy to look at China and say, like, look, you can say what you want about President Xi, but he's consistent, and there's a plan, and he has the room to execute. And that's a valid point. But always remember that capitalism and politics did work in this country. So none of that. So again, I'm only responding to COVID-19 infrastructure. Remember the beginning of the video, I said, you have to examine why did it work and why is it now working? But that's a separate subject. I will give the Professor Wolff the merit that these are good questions to ask. But I will say that the infrastructure could have been fixed. It can be fixed. Getting the right leaders in there is a harder point in this moment. You have to remember 100 years ago with FDR, he was in there for 3 terms. he declared, he basically turned into a President Xi. He's our only 3-term president. He was in there. Why? Because in that moment of extreme polarization, because America went through a populist movement, because the Roaring Twenties created the same polarizations. I mean, we were having a repeat somewhat of 100 years ago, and so the response was to have use the government balance sheet to build roads and bridges, and the response was to have FDR in there, a good leader, a decisive leader, in there for 3 terms, to have the consistency and the room to execute on the plan. You just can't have someone like Trump. Is he a good leader or not? You can debate that, right? Is Biden a good leader or not? You can debate that. You can debate any leader is a good leader or not. I think it's safe to say both of them are not the best examples of American presidents in the last 250 years. And I think it's also safe to say that they're both represent opposite sides of the same coin, because ultimately this is the same coin. It's always the same issues, right? Liberty, basic liberties and freedom, the Bill of Rights, the right to bear arms, the right to abortion, the gay rights.
Economy.
Yeah, the economy. It's always the same issues. It's always the same coin. So they are complete. There is no center of the coin. Centrism is gone. Biden and Trump are complete opposites of the same coin. And in the span of 8 years, you just can't have that. You're not going to get a good result, right? So is the solution to throw the baby out with the bathwater? Professor Wolff's suggestion that we should turn to Marxism and full cooperation and change boards to become massively cooperative. That's I'm saying that I don't think these first 2 examples are good examples. Hopefully, I've illustrated some points.
He's also sharing where to find the money to pay for the infrastructure, and he talks about the 600 richest billionaires in America.
Yeah.
And he said you could have them
Yeah.
pay for all the infrastructure, and they would still be the 600 richest people in America. Many of them are the richest people in the world, and to allow them to keep accumulating.
Yeah.
He's not in favor of that, and I think
He's not in favor of them continuing to accumulate.
Yeah, the very wealthy continuing to accumulate with not having to pay a reasonable part of their taxes. Amazon is basically replacing people with the way they operate. So he mentions Bezos, who had an idea 20 some years ago, and it worked. And instead of having all these brick and mortar stores, where we have to go and we have to spend time going to these stores and finding that they're out of what we want, we can go to Amazon and just with a few clicks we can get exactly what I want. It comes to our home and we're done with it. So I mean, how do you not win if you're replacing the brick and mortars that are not very functional?
How do you not win
if you're replacing the brick and mortars with purchases online?
You're saying that's a win.
That's how he won. How can he not win having started a company like Amazon that just replaced people that was not an easy functional thing to find what we wanted?
I'm not sure I understand your question. Sorry.
Well, I'm saying it's a no-lose situation if you replace something that's not working. Your company is going to be considered the god, and everybody's going to use it, just like the internet. We couldn't get enough of it. eBay and Amazon, we can't get enough of. We're just buying more and more.
Okay.
And so the addictive shoppers can use it, and the people who aren't addictive shoppers like us, we can find what we want, not have to waste a lot of time trying to find what we want. It's right there.
So what's the question?
No, it was a rhetorical question.
Yeah.
So he's saying for these people that profited from the lack of jobs and of people who used to have jobs at the brick and mortar stores, they should be taxed when they've got the billions of opportunity that they've been able to capitalize on. That's what his point of view is.
Yeah, so that gets back into the history, even just say post-World War II. Like, we had a middle class, and
an upper middle class.
So what you have to examine that, and it really is a bigger conversation. We can try to get into it a little bit. We still have a couple more items here, but that is the examination. How did we get to where we are today? How can you get Bezos having $200 billion, one man? And
yachts they don't even have time to use. That's another thing. Why are you going to have a $100 million yacht or a $600 million yacht that just sits there and is taking up space. What is the point in your psyche
Yeah.
to have that yacht
Yeah.
when people are homeless in Los Angeles? To me, as a human being, it doesn't make sense for me to have that yacht. If I wanted to do stuff with my time, I would do stuff with my time. I wouldn't just buy something that is a showpiece. What's the point of the showpiece?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there.
Okay.
So there's always philanthropy, but this is cyclical. Why is it cyclical? You have to analyze that. So where are we in the cycle? We're at an extreme point, right? In 1950, the marginal tax rate was 90%. The middle class was the GI Bill that was funding education. You had a massive explosion of the middle class, right? And then the conditions were such to support that. Then right around the end of the 70s, at the end of that tumultuous decade, you had in 1982, when that recession ended, you then had the beginning of the reversal of that, which now we are 40 years later, from 82 to 2022, 40 years later, and that's, again, a building up, just like of our infrastructure, same story, a building up of a problem that's now bursting because one man has $200 billion, right? I remember in 2005 or so, Hank McKinnell was the CEO of Pfizer, and he was leaving Pfizer after the stock went from $40 to $15 or so. So there was the stock had been demolished. He had made poor acquisitions. He had destroyed shareholder value. I was not a fan.
Lawsuits, probably.
Oh yeah, because then the next CEO, Ian Reed, was a lawyer, and they hired a CEO as a lawyer because they had so many lawsuits to defend. Not only and so many because they had massive patent expirations, so they had also to defend those patents. But the point is, Hank McKinnell left with a $200 million golden parachute.
After having
and
lost
I'm
money.
there. I inherited the stock. I recommended the sale of the stock, and I was like, anyway, that's a separate subject. Who in our portfolio? Who's driving here? Why are we holding this dog? But at the end of the day, it's like, are you kidding me? $200 million for destroying billions of dollars, for doing not only for not doing nothing. If you went sideways, that's one thing, but for destroying billions of dollars of shareholder, misallocating billions of dollars of capital, wiping out billions and billions of dollars of stock value, and you get paid $200 million to go away? I don't think so. That was like 2005, and so that was already almost 20 years ago. So, it's only gotten worse, right? And so capitalism needs to have referees. You alluded to something in your presentation there. I forget exactly what you said, but you have to have referees in a system. If there are referees there as regulators, a soccer player, will play the ball outside the outline. A tennis player will play a double bounce. I mean, not all will. There are some virtuous people, but there is a large enough percentage that will play foul balls to their advantage because they're just competitive out there, just want to win. And anyway, that's not their job, okay? You could say you should be a good sportsman, and you should be, okay? But that's on you. It's not your obligation to be, because there is someone on the field that's getting paid to be there. That's the referee, that's impartial and is enforcing the rules of the field, of the game. Capitalism has not had that. We've completely destroyed that, and it's led to problems and failures. Fix that. You fix the problem. Capitalism has worked. No one's talking about this. Nobody's talking about this. But it is a problem. It explains a lot of the problems we've had, and it explains how we can fix it. But where the system's going is not to talk about any of that. It's a crisis that's built, and there's a solution over here waiting. It's probably the Chinese blueprint for a quasi-cooperative, quasi-capitalist hybrid system, which is where we are being. And you have guys like Wolff out there, and the ex-finance minister of Greece. You have a lot of academics out there pushing that story, reminding everybody, coming down from their academic pedestals to talk in layman's terms. Professor Wolff talk in very simple terms. He's an economist. He was talking more like a politician. Very simple terms. His speech, his 1 hour speech, which I listened to, is very, no disrespect at all. I don't mean any disrespect.
You think his intentions are
No,
good?
it's probably a good thing, right? You're talking eye level to eye level. You're talking in very layman terms. But, so they're coming down from their academic pedestals. They're talking in plain English. And the Greek guys doing the same. There are others out there. I'm using those two as examples. But it's the same thing that I think, anyway, it doesn't need to go there, in my opinion. They're directing us towards a post-capitalistic movement of one of more cooperation, more socialism, more Marxism, or whatever that's going to be. And I'm here saying that we don't need to go there. We need to, if you have a system, you can choose your system, but you need the system as a system. And if you're not user error, right? If you start your car in third gear, you blow out your clutch, right? You need to operate the vehicle the way it's intended to. So
corporate profits, and I've been kicking around an idea, and I've taken economics classes before, but I don't know the numbers on what would work and what would make a corporation thrive and keep the employees happy. I mean, who doesn't want to keep the employees happy? Who wants to buy a Starbucks franchise and walk into the place and find gloom and doom?
Right.
Actually, some people do. Some people like creating chaos and disharmony and having everybody walk out and then just saying, I'm going to close the doors. And either they could do it out of spite or they could do it out of a government feedback or a government stipend that says, oh, your business is having trouble because he'll just say it's COVID related and now we get some money. But
you have different leaders for different times. So you have a wartime CEO.
Yeah.
And then you have a growth-minded CEO where things are growing, opportunity, the water level is rising. There's opportunity for all. You want to coddle, support, grow. But the wartime CEO is a totally different guy. That's a bad news bear.
And why do we look at having a year like next year? Let's say our profits in our Starbucks are down 15% than they were this year, right? Well, what changed in the economy? Maybe some more stores open. Maybe coffee, there were some articles written about it. Maybe people, whatever. There's reasons why a company that has the same work ethic, the same products, doesn't have as many sales the next year. And why do you fire somebody because the profits were down or the gross sales were down by 15% in a following year? You can't base next year on last year in every circumstance. You have to look at what's happening globally, but people are so simplistic, they can only look, some of them, like the stockholders, what is going on here? Why were sales down last year? I want to fire the CEO. I mean, what's going on? So that's one question.
There's a lot in there. You need to have a board that's impartial. You need to have good corporate governance. You need to have regulatory oversight of that board. And you can't have cronyism, and you need independent thinking. That's why boards are supposed to attract independent directors and to make those decisions that are hard. Because over time, companies themselves that are a reflection of industries, that are a reflection of economies, that are a reflection of societies, change. And you will need, corporations like Starbucks, that are over a 50-year period that are managing through so many different cycles and pivots and changes are going to require, over a long period, not short period, very different decisions, very different leadership, very different managerial changes, very different incentive plans. You've got to be able to, weave and maneuver through that. That's number one, independent board. And the board hires and fires the CEO. You need to choose the right CEO for the right moment in time and the right 5 or 10-year plan for the company. You've got to do that. And then you need to have the compensation plans tied. Pay performance is fine. I'm all about having some sort of cap. There's been a talk about that, some sort of multiple. The CEO should not make more than X times, whatever the number is. 10 times, 20 times, whatever. The number gets really out of control when you start earning $35 million like Jamie Dimon did at JP Morgan. Start earning, tens of millions of dollars per year, $40 million per year, and you got the guy at the bottom making 50,000. That's just like 1,000 times more, or whatever the number is. It's too out of skew. So I'm all about reward, but how much reward? It gets back to that $200 billion. And then what's then the leadership in the government? What are the tax loopholes? You know, you got guys, you know, Warren Buffett is a wolf in sheep's clothing. He says he pays his taxes, but what's his tax rate? It's 14%. It's like saying I pay my taxes, but like and you can't just say I pay $1 billion, like, because that means nothing. 14%, whereas the guy who's making, you know, 75,000 is paying 40% or whatever, 35%. That's not right. Warren's paying 14%.
He says that it's not right. He said,
and he does say it's not right. And he's playing within the system. And back to my analogy of the soccer player. Is it Warren's fault? Not really. He's not a politician. So he's a soccer player. He's playing the game. And by the way, he's actually calling his own foul, but he's saying it's not for me to call. He's saying I played a double ball. I'm only paying 14%. But if you're not going to stop me from playing a double ball, I'm going to play the double ball. Change the rule. Make me pay 30% or whatever. So there's all these loopholes and all these, you know, you get paid an outsized salary. Then you create the financial market conditions. That's the Fed and the Federal Reserve and the government that create the conditions that create asset bubbles. So now you have income. So now you have extra and disposable income. And if you're smart and strategic and long-term planner as an individual, you parlay that into financial assets. And now you have the government and the Federal Reserve creating conditions so as to blow up financial bubbles. So now that is outsized, your income, your annual income. So now becomes your financial assets because of the condition. Once again, you're just a soccer player. You didn't put interest rates at 0, but money is for free. So of course I'm going to borrow as much as I can. I'm going to leverage to the gills, right? Why would I do that? Because money's free. And I know there's a Fed put. Any sign of the economy coming down, the Fed's going to come in and save the day. So is there really any risk? Not really. I can leverage myself. I can borrow money for free. So now you have the balance sheet outsized. Okay. So, you know, and then on the other side is the taxation. So you have all these loopholes for investors and entrepreneurs to parlay their money into 1031 exchanges or IC disc companies or offshore, captive insurance companies or all these different loopholes, right? So, and you pick every decade, there's always a different loophole, right? In the 80s, it was the oil loophole. People were drilling holes and taking their net operating losses. And, you know, there's always ways to manage it. And there's a whole layer of very intelligent people facilitating that. So that's the problem. There's no leadership and regulatory. The referees are not doing their job. President Bush in 2005 went on public TV like a cheerleader with pom-poms saying, everyone should own a house. Everyone should not own a house. Everyone should not be extended a loan to buy a house. It is a dream to own a house, but they're just like driving a car. It's not a right. It's a responsibility. You can't just go and text and drive and run over a pedestrian. You're not a responsible driver. You shouldn't be given a license. Same thing for a homeowner. It's about managing capital. It's about saving money. It's about understanding debt, using debt wisely and productively, not destructively and adding undue risk to yourself and society. So Bush is out there from the highest level all the way down to the countrywide mortgage broker, 23-year-old what do you call that?
Dialing for dollar.
Dialing for dollar guy. All the way down, all the way to the top, all the way to the bottom. Okay, the whole system had the pom-poms on, and it's a bad parent. Bush should not be on TV proselytizing that. Greenspan knew about it. He left his parting gift. Thank you, Greenspan. The age of turbulence. Thank you, buddy. The age of turbulence that you set us into. Okay, thank you very much. He only wrote 2 academic papers in his tenure as chairman from, was it 86 to 06, 20 years, tenureship. And he only wrote 2 academic papers as Fed chairman in those 20 years. And the last one was, you know, at the tail end, 2006, oops, we have a problem, Houston. You created the problem. So, you know, but you got to kind of put all this together. My point to Professor Wolff and my bigger point to the audience here is that the system was being mismanaged at every level. You can move to a different system and you can put you can say, this will be great, let's be cooperative, right? Let's go into a democratic process, right? Respect is earned. You can move into a cooperative system and it can get spiral out of control. A socialist system, how does a socialist system make? That's a complex subject. How do we socially make decisions? There's a lot of pressure. There's a lot of pressure on people. It comes from the media. It comes from academia. It comes from your neighbor, right? And everyone, if you don't have a free and open society, then people zip it and they fall in line, even if they don't want to. And there's a lot of that going on right now. And that's one of the dangers of having a quote unquote cooperative system. It sounds great. And I'm not some I'm a libertarian, so that's a 4-letter word to a lot of people, but I'm a constitutionalist. I believe, on the virtue, back to that subject of the virtue of people have liberties, right? But you need to be independent thinking, but you also need to be cooperative in a society. And without growing up with that, having a family example, without having a presidential example, and all the layers in between, people walk out of the nests into the world with clipped wings, and they don't, how do I operate, and what is fair, what is virtuous, and how is the system really supposed to work, and what's my contribution, and how am I supposed to benefit, and what's that exchange? And no, none of that exists right now. And flopping over from some mismanaged capitalist system into some other cooperative socialist system, is that really going to work? No, the human condition needs to be balanced, back to Sifu's original point. We need to be integrated as human beings so that we know what our values are, and we know what we're capable of. We know what our responsibilities and contribution to ourselves and communities are, and that we have a fresh, open, healthy respect for our neighbor so that we can operate at the most basic level. It doesn't matter what system you use. If you have a whole bunch of little baby birds with clipped wings out there that are dysfunctional and confused about what their values are and how they're supposed to operate, any system is going to fail.
Thank you, Jason. That was what we call in the Joe Rogan experience a great rant.
That was a rant. Sorry.
And we need rants are cool. We're supposed to take the energy and let it out, because it's, as you read all of these books, right? It has to go somewhere, and if it just stays with you and it doesn't get out of you,
right,
not good. And if it's delivered in a positive form in terms of learning and sharing, then it's doing some more good than just you venting. And that's what we're doing here. We're letting out these thoughts. Now, I did hear you say bailouts. So I did want to comment on one thing that Richard Wolff says. And he said that the captains of industry in the United States and elsewhere, they are very private when it comes to profits. So they're in favor of privatization of profits. But when it comes to losses, they're all in favor of socialization of losses. Can you describe what that means to you?
Well, thank you. That's a really important point. And to me, it gets back to the referee. It's like the player on the soccer field. He's happy to score a goal, but he doesn't want the foul, right? So he'll hide, dodge, duck, and hide, and make excuses and point fingers because he doesn't want the red card. He wants to play. He's a player. He wants to stay on the field. He doesn't want to sit on the bench. So similarly, the captains of industry are no different. They need a regulator to enforce. They need a board to say, this is the compensation you can earn. It's not open-ended. It's not $200 billion. It's not to the moon. There has to be a fair compensation. Moreover, your conduct and your strategic, where you're going, this is what success looks like. This is what failure looks like. There's repercussions. If you don't succeed, we're going to have to move on and find someone else, right? And you
don't get the golden parachute just because you lawyer up.
You don't get the golden parachute. And back to the bigger point beyond an individual CEO, the corporation as a whole, that's the government's fault, right? You can't be too big to fail. In the last 20 years, and I could go way into the why. The why is what always interests me, but let's just talk about the what. what happened in the last 20 years is that we got away. We talked about the referee not being on the field. So the regulatory authorities, there was a bunch of children in the room and they were doing whatever they wanted. Okay, the grown-ups were not there. They were not keeping them in check. So that's one problem. We discussed that. Okay, then the next problem is, too big to fail. There's a pervasive fear. Okay, and I would say the story, not my version of it, but it's part of my explanation of it, is look at someone like Greenspan, right? Princeton economics professor. He's a Depression scholar, representative of this whole era that we have gone through and are currently going through, of scholars that are trying to do everything and anything not to repeat the Great Depression. So that's, in my mind, why, starting with Greenspan up to today, we have the Fed put. It's at any moment, recession, we need to manage this, right? And we need to just blow our debt and deficits and use our Federal Reserve balance sheet to no end, okay, to prop up that system. Okay, and so
quantitative easing and fiat current money.
Right. So that creates many problems. So the relevant problem, what we're discussing right now, is the too big to fail. Right. So if you're, and that goes back to consolidation. So now you have fascism, corporatism. So as an analyst and a portfolio manager since 2001, I've seen, and you can go way back before that, and I did do that. I looked at pharmaceutical transactions back to the 70s, so I could see exactly how, actually back to IG Farben, the German original, which is now 4 different companies, and how those companies broke up and came together, and ultimately the percentage concentration of power or revenue within any given industry, you'd call banks, going from 10,000 banks to 5,000 banks. Previously we're at 15,000 banks. It's concentration of power within an industry, and the false illusion of this cycle of conglomerate building and busting, right? You call it the trust busting, right? Teddy Roosevelt was the trust buster, right? It's kind of a false illusion because in my observation right now is you have this massive consolidation, and true, it might be GE. GE is a good example. It turns into a conglomerate. But each of those separate 6 businesses have all consolidated themselves. So if DuPont or GE or Pfizer, whoever, Pfizer spits out an animal health business. DuPont spits out a agri-science, seed and fertilizer business. Those are all massively concentrated their market shares. So breaking that trust or that conglomerate is a false illusion because the power is still so concentrated. And that leads to the problem is that too big to fail. Number one, you shouldn't have it too big to fail because that's what capitalism is. Okay, if you're David and Goliath, if you're Goliath, if you're the 800-pound gorilla, you should have a completely different approach to risk and treating capital than a small startup, which is more footloose and fancy-free and willing to take on risk because the risk and reward, it's a completely different matrix.
They don't have 40,000 employees at the startup.
You have back to your point, you have to treat responsible employees well. You do. You have to treat them with respect. You have to make them feel like they have some buy-in, that they can align with the mission, that they can go to work every day and feel good about what they're doing with their time.
Structure their lives around the fact that this company is a good place to park 10 hours of their energy every day.
That you call that Marxism or whatever, I'm 100% on board for that. But back to the point. So you have these massive companies that are too big to fail. They've concentrated their power. And my point is, so 1950 versus 1975 versus today, the largest companies in any industry failing would have a completely different impact on the economy. Because now, let's say the top 3% of companies, it depends if you're telecom, right, or a bank, so it's too hard to give you a number because it's industry specific. But just suffice it to say that every single industry has massively concentrated the market share over the last post-World War II. So the impact of the largest company or companies failing is catastrophic, truly. So those companies, therefore, and the boards should reflect this ethos is they should manage their risk accordingly, right? And should we let them fail? Well, then that comes back down to the depression, I mean, that ethos of trying to at all costs avoid another depression. Maybe we should have a cleansing. Maybe that would be good for an entitled society that's grown lazy. There's no, I hate to say this.
Bored and lazy.
Truly hate to say this, but there is no more powerful motivator than fear. And I hate to drive that point because I'm actually really not a believer in that. I think that it should be virtuous, it should be an internal fire, and that you should be driven by your passions, and that should be an organic. But the reality is that a lot of people, unfortunately, don't have that and are not guided by that. And but fear does motivate pretty much 99% of people. And so maybe these kid gloves and that we have pervasive in parenting, in academia, a student's journey through college, and a child's journey through elementary school, and being parented by parents that don't enforce consequences, and a government that doesn't enforce consequences, and a corporation that doesn't really enforce consequences, leads to bad results and bad output. And so maybe we should have that,
quantitative
reset.
reality.
Reset. By the way, everyone's talking about this year, 2022, the World Klaus, whatever his name is, at the World Economic Forum. They're talking about the Great Reset. So what does that mean? It's the fourth industrial revolution. It's a different reset than the one I'm talking about, right? I'm talking about going back to basics. They're talking about transcendentalism into the fourth industrial revolution, which in my mind is transhumanism, which in my mind is automation, which automation is not bad in of itself. Technology, I have a book right here called Technology and War. This is a great book. And the misuse of technology is the point. It's not technology by itself. Technology by itself is not a problem. Any tool, whether it's a shovel, a gun, or a car, doesn't matter. A computer, misused is a bad tool because the driver, it's the fault of the driver, not the tool
Or
itself.
the orders given to the driver.
Right.
Like in a wartime.
Exactly. Right. They did all the psychological soldiers studies to prove that when your sergeant tells you to shoot the Vietnamese child, that the 18-year-old boy has this cognitive dissonance going on, but he does it because Stanley Milgram proved to us that people obey authority, and they don't do it, and that's the PTSD. You've broken your mind. That 18-year-old comes home, and that's a destroyed life because you're not supposed to kill children.
So last thing, my hypotheses or my example about corporate profits. So let's say on the balance sheet that the CEOs and the directors aren't allowed to take their salaries and put them in the balance sheet and then say our profits are based at the number that was subtracted by our salary. So let's start out with the profits before salary. And in a good year, let's say they're split, 90% of those profits go to the employees. This is after you've put the money in research and development and all those things that a company should do. So the profits, 90% to the employees in terms of salaries, 10% with the owners and stockholders. And my answer to that is it better for the money to be in the many hands or few hands? So I don't know if this is a workable solution, but I don't like the idea of the head of Home Depot saying, oh, we had a good year, therefore I'm going to take 150 million out of that, and now we haven't had that good of a year, and that therefore we're not going to give raises and Christmas bonuses to the employees who are making $12 or $15 an hour, which I don't know about you, but $12 or $15 an hour doesn't get you very far in 2022. What are your thoughts on that new way of seeing profits and having a law in place that says you can't use the gigantic corporate salaries and stock bonuses as a way to detract or subtract from the balance sheet to show that you're not making that much money?
I think I have a friend named Rob Steiler. I'd like to introduce you to him. He has a company he's trying to build called Crew, and he's been in the multi-level marketing for 30 years, and he's ran a bunch of teams. And so he has envisioned a new model, more to one to which that you just spoke to, and he has the algorithms all worked out. It's basically, in a nutshell, basically saying that you have to contribute, right? So you need to work, right? If you're a sales organization like an MLM, you need to sell. So you don't get to eat unless you do something. You have to contribute something. But then from there, he moves on to say, an MLM, the problem is now you're in the system, you've sold something, you're a producer to some degree, but 90% of people, 95% of profits go to 1%. It's it's probably the most extreme example of have and have not. The MLM system is a very flawed system. So his vision is to keep some percentage of the sale, I believe it's 60%, that goes to the direct person that made the sale, and then to keep 10% to go to the company, and then 30%, he calls it circular wealth. It gets recycled back into the sales organization in an algorithm that, like I said, if you're not producing anything, you don't get any of that 30%. But if you are a producer, according to your production, you will get topped off. Let's say you made only $1,000. Maybe this makes it $1,250 or something, whatever. I don't know exactly what his algorithm is, but this is a guy that's thought about for 30 years, and he could be a next interview for you.
Yeah, that would be really good to hear. So one of the things I wrote down to end this on, is it good to question tradition? And some people, the arguments that many young people have with their parents and their uncles and their grandparents is this idea of questioning tradition. But if you look at what we've done since we've been hunter-gatherers to the agrarian, to factory workers, to enforcing child labor laws and enforcing term limits and eliminating Tammany Hall in New York City, we've always questioned tradition. So that idea that our parents are offended by us questioning tradition, like asking, why am I going to this specific church? Why am I believing in the American system, which Ralph Nader calls the corporate plutocracy? And I heard him say that in the 1980s, and a light bulb went off in my head, because I've worked in the corporate world and I know the influence they have. That's wherever the money is. And if you're a politician and you want to get elected, you have to go to where the money is. The money is in the banks and the corporate world. It's not in the teacher's retirement plan, and they have votes, but in terms of money to fund your campaign, the teachers have to go, you have to go through the lobbyists to the teachers in order for them to write a check. And there's a lot of interplay that goes on to get money from a teacher who's making $60,000 to $80,000 a year, whereas a corporate person like a Bezos, who's got $200 billion a year, or whatever that number is, they can write you a $10 million check today, and if they want to invest.
He's not going to write it. His clerk will write it.
Yeah, his clerk will write it, but they can make a decision just like that. They can give their barber or beautician a $20,000 tip, whereas if you're working for the teachers organization, you have to have entire meetings and votes around the politicians to whom you're going to donate money. So I wanted to make sure that you understand that questioning tradition is a long piece of the American way and the historical way of living. Bruce Lee, use what works, reject what doesn't work. And we've always done that, so continue to question the traditions that have been handed down to you or promulgated upon you. Any last thoughts on that?
I love it. And when I think of tradition, I think of not just like a cultural practice or some sort of symbolic kind of gesture or ceremony, tradition, right? We have lots of traditions at Princeton, right? That didn't make any sense. They create social glue, right?
The scary things we do to fraternity pledges, where they die in the back of a U-Haul.
Right. They build the glue in the social team. But when I think of tradition, I go a little bit beyond that. I think of the historically speaking, like naturopathic knowledge. Like I think of the encyclopedia that existed up to 1928. Rockefeller got rid of it, but that was used, even sold by J&J in the 1880s. They sold this encyclopedia.
What was it called?
I don't, look that up. I don't know. But basically,
it was before giant pharmaceutical companies had really gained traction.
Correct. Yeah. So it was because Rockefeller created the modern medical system in 1913. He funded it. He came up with a whole curriculum, and in so doing, he phased out. It took him about 10 to 15 years, but he got rid of that naturopathic. Got rid of it out of the curriculum. It takes a generation. That's the point here, people. I'll just reiterate that, is that when you have a culture that's like, and you go back to the 1913, go back to World War I, 1918. You would have had a whole bunch of doctors saying, what is this? Why are we throwing this out? This is wrong. This has value. And they would have been activists, and they would have fought for it. I don't actually know any of this, but it has to have been the case. And that's kind of the point, is that those people, they die. And then you have World War II, and then you come back, and then you have the whole propaganda campaign of showing babushka in black with a shawl with one tooth as the midwife, and versus a white hospital with a lab coat and a badge. And and then it's obvious when you see that psychologically that you're going to go to the hospital that's clean and germ-free, right? And you're not going to go with the midwife babushka. But that's all propaganda, and it all just is about managing that. But my point is going back to the information and tradition. This was information that was built up over centuries or millennia, right? This was knowledge about bushes and tinctures and remedies and whatever, through stories, through trial and error.
Microbiome in the soil.
All of that was sculpted over time and put in an encyclopedia and taught and passed down. And all of that was wiped out in one generation, a couple of decades. So that's, I believe in that kind of tradition. That's probably not tradition in the technical term, but that historical record and that human knowledge that we build that collectively. Talk about collective and cooperation. That was a cooperative, that one person, Rockefeller, comes back and he was able to write that check. And he built the medical. So that's talking 100 years ago, 1913, versus today, Bezos with his 200 billion. J.P. Morgan, 1907, bailed out the country. One person, the financial crisis of 1907, one person bails out the country. Interesting juxtaposition of time periods, but all going back to tradition is a good thing. Cooperation is a good thing. Again, what you have to go into, Professor Wolff, what are we actually talking about? What are we actually discussing, analyzing, and debating? Because I've challenged a lot of things that he said today. I don't necessarily inherently disagree with a lot of the things that he says. That's why you got to sit down and really get your fingers into it and talk very concretely about what is the point.
Is he an important force bringing back the philosophy of Hegel and Marx and giving it an honest look, though it's been abandoned by most academia? Is it good that we have a Dr. Wolff doing his podcast?
In my observation, academia is a chorus that builds with one voice, and ultimately authorization by the university, by the grants, by the people that are not professors, that are kind of behind the scenes, making strategic decisions or funding decisions, and then that professor is the expert and comes forth, but he's authorized, and they come forth, and then they come forth more and more and more and more, right? And then all of a sudden you have an orchestra, and that's the way I believe. That's the way I've invested. So the health and wellness movement that was coming out 20 years ago, that's how I looked at it. I studied J&J and some of the bigger companies that were espousing health and wellness. They have venture capital arms, and they make little acquisitions, and I follow those acquisitions. And then I also listen to academia, I listen to media, I follow the companies, Nature's Bounty and other companies that are producing supplements, and then I follow the consumer. And ultimately you need a confluence of academia and media and government and corporations and the consumers to come together to make a trend investable. And it's ultimately a chorus. It's not one person waving the flag. Look at post-capitalism, cooperative Marxist movements. It's not one person writing that white paper. It becomes a chorus that's justified by the current context. Right now we are in a massive crisis, a period of change. Our society is broken. We're becoming more polarized. We could easily have a civil war if we're not already in a civil war right now.
They call it a soft civil war.
It's a soft civil war. We're in it right now, clearly. events like Roe v. Wade being overturned. There's more and more of these. It's accelerating. The pain is accelerating. People are getting more and more anxious. And so it's a moment to be activist, and it's a moment to catalyze change. Who are the leaders? I find it very leaderless. I find the Black rights movement to be very respectable. I've joined some of those conversations, and I've challenged them to say, look at Martin Luther King. Here was a guy leading from his heart, as bright as he was, and he was a bright individual, incredibly bright. Mostly he was amazing because he was a Mother Teresa. He led from his heart. And he was credible because he was so eloquent. He could speak, and he had this vision, and he was intellectual, but he was virtuous and he led from his heart. Who wouldn't follow that? And by the way, of course, he's right, because everyone does deserve equal respect. But you look at the leaders today, I don't see that. I see the opposite. I see a lot of angry people that are not eloquent, that are not leading from the heart.
Fear-based.
Fear-based people. That's just my observation. That's my observation. I don't see that ending well. If you want to be the change, you need to be the change. You need to grow big. You need to get bigger. If you, the person that feels persecuted, or you identify with history of long-term persecution, you need to acknowledge that we are in a different moment, that the winds of change are blowing, that the opportunity is there. And you need to say, am I really fighting this? No, and take a long-term view and take that, companies. I met with the CEO of Cargill, largest private company in America. I met with the chairman, who was the first non-Cargill family member to be CEO of Cargill. I met with him in a private meeting. The first thing he said is well, we start planning with a minimum of 50 years. That's the first thing he said out of his mouth. I was not surprised by that at all. Companies and large corporations plan in 50 plus years. Human beings plan 2 weeks ahead, maybe.
What am I having for dinner
What
tonight?
am I doing? What did I do last weekend? What are you doing this weekend? I don't know. So just think about the thought and the planning goes into that. Think of the scale of that, and try to just digest that and think about the movement, the moment that we're in. With all this, everyone's like, don't tell me what to do with my body. I agree. I'm a libertarian, but to me, it's a no-brainer. Absolutely, it's your choice to do what you want with your body. Who am I to tell you?
But don't ask me to pay for the people who have to do the home care on you because you lost a lung from smoking, or you want a $5,000 automated driving system because you're 350 pounds, because you have addictions and compromise your system and you can't get out of that rut. Do you want me to pay for that? You want society to pay for that? If you want out of this planet, you're doing a very good job. Be out of this planet, but don't ask me to sustain you for 30 to 50 years.
Be accountable.
Yeah, be accountable.
Be accountable. Amen to that. I'm sort of a spiritual person. I'm not an organized religious person. But that resonates a lot with me. It's like we all need to be accountable. We all need. If you listen to an Olympic athlete, one of the main things that you'll hear these young athletes say is they have a support system, right?
9 people maybe around.
Yeah, and so that everyone we need. We're social creatures. We all deserve and we need that support system, sounding boards, resources, and to help us get through hard times and to celebrate the good times and to, and just to be there. Get that, build that network for yourself and be accountable. Don't eat cupcakes and smoke a pack of cigarettes to hide your pain. Like, I don't mean to be preachy there. I understand why people do that. I completely have compassion for people that do that, and people do that, and there is a lot of pain systemically that's hidden, because in our culture, we're not supposed to expose that pain. We're supposed to just put it under the rug, right? So there's a lot of pain there. Find a community where you can be vulnerable, where you can be authentic, where you can get that out and you can share it. Build that. That's the best thing you'll do. You'll stop smoking those cigarettes, But if that's the path you're going to take, I agree with Sifu. You got to be accountable, right? And you got to know, eyes wide open, stimulus or action response, right? If you smoke a pack of cigarettes a day, unless you're that one Japanese person that lives to 115 that has, some gene that, circumvents those health repercussions, it exists. It's the anomaly. It's the 1 out of a billion. not the rule. The rule is that you're going to get lung cancer and you're going to die.
Mm-hmm.
And you're going to have poor quality. You might live to your 70, and it's the last 15 years of your life will be poor quality. So
on that note, in summary, that learning acquisition takes context. So if you're someone who's new to some of these topics and you're dissatisfied because you're not following those references and observations, it will take time for you to go through some of the books and videos and history and conversations that we've gone through, and we're inviting you to do that. You don't have to. You could take our word that some things are broken and some things are working and some things we hope will be working differently. But we've given you a lot of observations that are based on contextual learning that we've done, where we started out with one hypothesis and we were proved, whether it was in 1 year or 10 years, that it was not a valid hypothesis. So we had to switch and adopt another point of view and look into that one. But we're always open to drop any of our observations, hypotheses, conclusions, if there's new information that convinces us otherwise. Is that enough of a bow to tie this up in?
That's nice. Nicely said. Yeah, keep an open mind, Try to check the ego at the door, have opinions, be researched, have convictions, but don't have the confirmation bias. Keep your mind open. An open mind is a beautiful mind.
Open mind, open heart, and have a little cognac beforehand if you don't have an alcohol problem. Before you take a look at some of these videos that dive deep into things that aren't always pleasant. Aloha on that. So wishing you all the best in your health, happiness, wellness, and intellectual pursuits. I'm Sifu Slim with Jason Jewell, sifuslim.com, and your email?
holisticinvestor@gmail.com. It's been a pleasure. Thank you, Sifu.
Aloha.
Aloha.